for a point of comparison, the German armed forces in 2022-23 could field about 8 brigades worth of forces, but of those, depending on whose reporting you look into, maybe 2 to 3 of those brigades could be made ready for a peer fight given 3 months warning. Whereas for a point of comparison, West Germany in the 1980s in the Cold War could field 36 brigades. So they fell a long way off where they had been, but now they're working back up to it. And I think the Russians will be regretting the decisions they've made to get to this point. Well, they will certainly be building on a lot of the activity that has occurred in the last few years. Germany, I think the head of the US command in NATO and also the full-time NATO commander said they took a holiday from readiness after the end of the Cold War, which was putting it politely. But they've come a long way in the last few years and are now the largest defense spender in Europe, having overtaken the UK. And they've been relatively crucial in delivering quite a vast quantity of military aid as well as financial aid to the Ukrainians, although on several occasions, I think they had to be pushed quite hard to get there, in particular sort of heavy weapons. It was Britain's decision to send Challenger 2 tanks, which then encouraged other European countries and Germany to deliver modern main battle tanks. And there's still yet to make a decision on the Taurus long-range missiles when we've been supplying Storm Shadows for some time. So they've played an important role, albeit sometimes a reluctant one. But they've definitely grown in enthusiasm for support for Ukraine over the last year in particular. And hopefully this meeting will build on what's been established already to go even further.
And Britain has previously, been a pretty strong leader, certainly on support for Ukraine and on European defence, alongside nations like France. Is there more work they can do with Germany politically to boost European defence?
Yes, I think it's probably worth outlining what current cooperation goes on between the UK and Germany. So a lot of that occurs through NATO, with the armed forces of both countries working very closely on exercises, on capability requirements, standardization of equipment, which we've seen in Ukraine has come in very handy when everyone uses the same caliber of weaponry, particularly for artillery shells, even though they've all got lots of different types of artillery, which is probably a bit of a nightmare for a Ukrainian logistician, but at least they're getting a lot of the stuff that they need. So in addition to that, Germany hosts a British forward holding base at Senelaga, as well as a number of small storage facilities and barracks when British troops are visiting on exercise. And this is a bit of a drawdown from what it was during the Cold War, when we had an entire sort of army corps, the British Army of the Rhine base there. I think now the only permanent British formation is a joint binational amphibious engineer battalion. So it's gone down from sort of tens of thousands of troops to several hundred, but that's because NATO's borders have moved as members have joined. Recently, there was last year in October the Trinity House Agreement, which was the sort of first step in the new Labour government in the UK's approach to rebuilding ties with European countries. A lot of it was, there was no sort of big wow announcement from the Trinity House Agreement, but there was a lot of smaller bits and pieces that together produced quite an impressive array of agreements. So there were things like Rheinmetall, the German defense company, building a factory to produce artillery barrels in Sheffield in the UK, and it's the first time in 10 years that the UK has had the ability to build barrels for its military, which is a bit concerning, but at least it's back. There were agreements to work on long-range strike weapons, although we don't know how soon that will be able to be achieved. There was an agreement for German P-8 Poseidons, which is a maritime patrol aircraft, which we also use to spend some time at RAF Lossiemouth in Scotland to help conduct patrols of the North Atlantic looking for Russian submarines. And there were a lot of agreements about working together on drones. But even prior to Trinity House, there had been a number of examples of the UK and Germany working together. You've got the Boxer armoured fighting vehicle, which is now being produced in Telford for the British Army, as well as in use by the Germans. There's the Eurofighter Typhoon, the fighter program, the A400, which is a transport aircraft. So there's been a lot already, and they've certainly increased it in recent recent months. I think what's most important about this visit is, of course, Merz is in charge of a new German government. So the Trinity House agreements were with the old SPD government under Olaf Scholz. And although the SPD are still in government, they're the smaller party now in the coalition. So it'll be a good opportunity to re-establish what was agreed previously and see where it can be taken forward in the future. And interestingly as well, of the two governments, the Minister of Defence, Boris Pistorius, has stayed on. So that's a nice point of continuity.
And I want to get an idea. I mean, how big is Germany as a military producer in Europe itself? Is it one of the larger military producers of European nations, or where does it fit alongside nations like France, for example?
Yeah, so Germany has a very healthy military industrial base. They produce a lot of equipment, in particular for land forces. The Leopard 2 is, pretty ubiquitous tank across European NATO armies. They produce a lot of artillery systems. They're involved in several fighter programs, and they've struggled to ramp up production, as has everyone, in the light of demand for supplying Ukraine, but they play a very, very important role. And I think it's quite good how the UK's sort of naval focus complements quite well with the German land focus as a partnership for bolstering European security.
And how do you think Russia will be reading into this boost in defense spending and cooperation across Europe, but especially with nations like Germany, considering that Germany for some time has been really very hesitant to be seen to be sort of trying to stand up to Russia militarily?
Yeah, so I think it's part of the sort of long-term strategic losses that Russia has faced after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. You've got Sweden and Finland joining NATO, which if you'd have asked people before 2022, they said would have probably never happened, which is a huge blow to Russian ambitions in Europe. And then the fact that Germany now is seriously ramping up its defence spending. They're up to, I think, £80 billion now. The UK is at about £65 billion, whereas previously Germany was spending less than the UK. So they've gone up a lot in the last few years. And hopefully that is then translated into real military capability, because although Germany was already spending a lot of money, not as much in percentage of GDP terms as other countries, but it's still a significant sum of money. The readiness of their armed forces prior to 2022 left a lot to be desired, as General Cavoli said when they took a holiday. So just for a point of comparison, the German armed forces in 2022-23 could field about 8 brigades worth of forces, but of those, depending on whose reporting you look into, maybe 2 to 3 of those brigades could be made ready for a peer fight given 3 months warning. Whereas for a point of comparison, West Germany in the 1980s in the Cold War could field 36 brigades. So they fell a long way off where they had been, but now they're working back up to it. And I think the Russians will be regretting the decisions they've made to get to this point.
And we saw across the Atlantic in the US yesterday, Mark Rutte alongside Donald Trump making that announcement that missiles will be bought by Europe to be given to Ukraine. That does sound very similar to a German offer to buy Patriot missiles to be provided to Ukraine. Do we know if how intensely Germany has been involved in putting this agreement together?
It's unclear based off what we've got so far to work from who exactly was most involved. I'm sure Mark Rutte as well was involved in those conversations. He was there in the room with Trump when Trump was talking about the agreement to sell on weapons to the Europeans. But the Germans will have definitely played an important role, especially because whether it's EU funding or individual member funding, German money will play a crucial role in paying for those missile systems. Although I think Trump said 17 launches, but it's not entirely clear where those will come from. Although coincidentally, the Swiss had agreed a few years ago to buy 17 Patriot launchers from the Americans. So yeah, that would be speculation, but potentially that might be what he was talking about. Although it's worth recognizing, I think, that for the Ukrainians, what's more important than boosting the number of launcher systems they've got for Patriot is making sure they've got the missiles to put in those launchers, which Patriot missile production is it's ramped up a lot, but it's still a long way off the global demand of the US and its allies, particularly given that the US has to contend with, dealing with the Chinese military buildup, where Patriot missile defenses would play a crucial role in any conflict over there.
And you mentioned before the German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius. He was also in the US yesterday while that announcement was going on, elsewhere meeting with his counterpart in America, Pete Hegseth. Do we know much about that meeting? And more than that, how much does it speak to the increasing role that Germany is playing in European support for Ukraine?
Yeah, the Germans have been a crucial part of encouraging the new US administration to support the Ukrainians. But I think it's also worth remembering the influence that other European countries have played. I think Poland, in particular, doesn't get enough love in the media space for the actions they've taken over the last 3 years. While everyone else has been making grand announcements about plans to spend more, they've quietly got on with it. They're now at over 5% of GDP, I think, on defense already, and they had plans which they're well into now of generating two new divisions for their land forces, not two new brigades, two new divisions. And they've also bought a lot of US equipment, so they have a lot of influence with the US Department of Defense, who's keen to support Poland as a crucial US ally, and they've also played their part.
And how do you think the Russians will be reacting then to this sort of solidification and of European NATO, and the fact that the US, compared to a few months ago, seems to be more willing, if at a cost, to really support NATO, whereas before it was a bit more of a tough love situation?
Yeah, I think the Russians have definitely misplayed their hand with the Trump administration, who, when they came in, were very willing to try and listen to Russian demands. But it seems that their lack of willingness to reduce what their demands are and their continued, horrific bombardments of Ukraine administration, that they are less trustworthy than they might have initially thought they were going into negotiations, and that supplying the Ukrainians with what they need is the right thing to do.
Well, Will Freer, thank you very much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.